Well, good morning. Thank you for the indulgence this morning of having me record a sermon on Friday so that it will be ready for Sunday. As you probably know, Julie's Aunt Barbara passed away about a week ago, so she is up there preparing for the funeral that will be happening this afternoon. I'll be traveling up on Saturday, and so this will give me an opportunity to be with them on Sunday afternoon to be part of that. But I still wanted to continue our series through the book of Ruth. As we mentioned last week, the book of Ruth is a remarkable book in the Bible for a number of different reasons. First of all, it's named after the female protagonist of the story, which is notable in itself. Women are often not even named in Bible stories, but here we have three remarkable women who are named and feature prominently in the narrative. What's even more notable is the perspective that's shared. Scholars observe that in addition to the masterful storytelling, the women's perspectives in this story are vividly described. From Naomi's advice on how to present their case to Boaz to even the townspeople's response to Naomi's good fortune in chapter 4, the words and the circumstances are realistic and historically plausible. It is a remarkable book. A few years ago, where is it? There it is. A few years ago, I bought a paperback spy novel written by Stephen James called The Pawn. It's part of a series where each book's named after a chess piece. It's the story of Pat Bowers, special agent for FBI, and this hero has a doctorate degree in forensics. Of course he does. And he's spent 8 years with U.S. Special Forces. And he's a cafe aficionado. And somehow he's completely jacked. And he's still somehow in his late 30s. The series was underwhelming, mostly because the author didn't appear to have any imagination for what it would actually look like to talk to an actual woman. The dialogue throughout the book, wherever women were involved, was simply ridiculous. Even conversations between the men, for that matter, it was just completely unbelievable. Quite the opposite here. In our story, Naomi suffers tremendous losses, one after the other, and comes to this desperate conclusion that was tragically realistic in her time. Without her husband and without her sons in a foreign country, she was wrung out. She was emptied out without any hope at all. Our story begins with vivid details that are captured economically with just a limited number of words. So much gets said in the first 5 verses. In the days when the judges ruled, one translator captures it, famine stalked the land. The word picture of famine is the subject of the sentence. Famine stalking the people of Israel like prey. It's chilling. With famine measuring each of your steps, want and need hiding around each dusty corner. In the foothills of Judea, dry, parched fields groaned under the heat of too many summers that followed springs and winters with little or no rain. As the seed stores dwindled and the food rations tightened, the options for Elimelech and Naomi would have shriveled to just 2. Abandon their home for the prospect of a meager living outside of Israel, or watch their 2 boys starve here in their dusty home. The words here at the beginning of the story are sparse. We don't know much about their desperate decision. Who did they consult, I wonder? Why did they choose Moab? When did they finally make that decision to go? But verse 2, with its shortage of words, tells us that Elimelech determined to, quote, live as a foreigner in Moab. The Hebrew verb here means to sojourn, and it suggests a temporary stay in Moab. Just a couple of years, Elimelech said. I can see the rains have returned to Moab. Maybe just for the growing season. Let's bring the boys and let's just pack the essentials. We'll keep to ourselves and we'll just pick what we need to keep some meat on our bones. And we'll be back here in no time, maybe a year or maybe 2. When Naomi left the Judean hillside, she probably thought she'd be back sooner. But this temporary trip became a personal exile as the famine stalked their steps. 1 year became 2, and finally became 10. Shortly after their arrival, Elimelech died, and without the strength nor the means to even visit Israel, much less return, there was no way for them to find wives for their sons within the clan, within Israel. And with no return in sight, the boys began families of their own, marrying 2 women in Moab, Orpah and Ruth. It might escape our notice today, but the ladies in this story surely noticed that famine stalked them in other ways too. No children were born to either of these women during the 10 years of exile in Moab, and as you can probably guess, this was a devastating burden to bear, and it might have added to the further guilt of Naomi. "We should never have left," she whispered to herself, too afraid to speak her real fears aloud. And then finally, the famine devoured the boys too, one by one, bringing all 3 women low. A household of grief, a household of emptiness and sorrow. Now an even more bitter decision awaits to be made, and Naomi has no one to help her choose. The cruel calculus that led them to leave Israel in the first place now adds up in favor of the opposite conclusion. Without a husband now, and without sons, Naomi has no one to advocate for her here in Moab. And even if there was food, she's got no means to buy it. She must go home, and she must go home alone. Orpah reluctantly agrees to remain with her people in Moab, but Ruth responds with a powerful and overwhelming example of steadfast love. "I will never, ever, ever leave you," she says. We'll talk more about Ruth and about her beautiful covenantal promise next week, but instead, I want to look at Naomi this week. In spite of this beautiful profession of faith, this beautiful promise, Naomi returns home in sorrow and despair. But there is no small fuss upon her arrival. After more than 10 years away, Naomi returns against all odds. But she returns home alone, but not quite alone. "Naomi, is that you? What happened?" But before she is willing to tell the tale, before she even introduces Ruth, she declares, "Don't call me that." Naomi derives from a Hebrew root that means to be pleasant or to be kind, but her name, Naomi, is short for Naomi Yahu, which means in full the pleasantness or the kindness of the Lord. But Naomi cannot bear this platitude. She can't play at this pretense any longer. Even without unpacking her bags, she declares, "Don't call me that. I am no longer kind or pleasant. The Lord has not been kind or pleasant with me. Call me Mara, for my life is bitter." Her name is now bitter. With this name change, Naomi summarizes her interpretation of this entire experience. Casting all subtlety to the ground, she charges God with the change in her circumstances and her grief. Look at verse 21. "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why should you call me Naomi when the Lord has responded harshly against me? The Almighty has caused me such misfortune." Verse 21 and 22. There is bitterness in this response, even more when you explore the Hebrew. Naomi inserts a personal pronoun I for emphasis. It's not necessary because it's implied by the verb here. And then she arranges the rest of that second sentence to place Yahweh at the very end. Literally in the Hebrew it reads, "I full went away, but empty brought me back Yahweh." She pits herself against God in this declaration at the opposite end of the sentence, with adjectives full and empty, both in the emphatic position. I imagine this to be a bitter declaration. Naomi's eyes are red and swollen as she declares. She would be crying if there were any tears left. "Don't call me Naomi, for I am bitter." But there is something not even right with the statement. If we understand full in terms of food and material possessions, then the first statement Naomi makes is completely false. They were hopelessly poor when they left. Instead, maybe she means in terms of security and progeny. When she left, she was secure in her husband. Her future was secure with her 2 sons. But now she has neither. And even more importantly, the second phrase in verse 22, it's clear Naomi holds God responsible for this. Is it wrong to blame God? Have you ever had misfortune in your life and struggled to understand why God would let something like this happen? It can come in a host of different ways: a job loss, a cancer diagnosis, a continuing crisis in the life of one of your kids. Why does God allow bad things to happen at all? This question is based on a basic premise that God is sovereign, which is to say that God directs every outcome. And there is a sense in which that is true. The prophet Isaiah relays God's words to the people of Israel in chapter 45, verse 7, when he says, I form the light and create the darkness. I make prosperity and I create disaster. I, the Lord, do all of these things. And then later in the next chapter, he writes, remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God and there is no other. I'm God and there is none like me. I say my purpose will stand and I will do all that I please. What I have said, that I will bring about. What I have planned, that I will do. Isaiah 46, 9-11. If God is willing to take responsibility for everything, then is it wrong then to blame him when disaster and heartache strikes us? Some faulty thinking sneaks in unnoticed when we are trying to unravel this theological problem. The word blame means to find fault with, and blaming goes beyond just acknowledging God's sovereignty. Blaming God implies that he messed up, that there is a fault to be found in him. When we blame God, we make this small step in our thinking and we place ourselves in a position to be his judge and his jury. Connected with that is the assumption that we can see all ends, that we can understand all outcomes of our current crisis. In order to unravel this, there's a couple of things that are vital to be brought to light. We live in a fallen world. God does not cause bad things to happen, but through humanity's capacity to choose, sin creates a host of bad consequences, both intended and unintended. When we refuse to follow God's direction and we choose to go our own way, we sometimes experience the immediate consequences of our actions, sometimes now and sometimes later. But there are other times the consequences of our actions are experienced by others. We make mistakes and other people pay for them. And similarly, sometimes we experience the fallen nature of our world through no immediate fault of our own. Disease or disaster arrives through no fault of ours, and we experience pain and profound grief and loss. And sometimes we experience this and we interpret this as somehow a punishment from God for our sins or our offenses that are committed. But it's important for us to understand that God does not cause disaster or disease. We live in a fallen world, a world that's not the way it was meant to be. In fact, one thing the scripture makes perfectly clear, that no matter what you think about God, you can't say that God doesn't care when we suffer, that there is great comfort in that. God comes near to those who are suffering. He comes near to his people, especially when they suffer. God became one of us and struggled as we have. God experienced betrayal and loss. As profound a thought as it might be, God knows what it's like to bury a parent. God knows what it's like to bury a friend or a family member. God knows what it's like to be wrongfully accused of something, to be abused. Scripture tells us that God is close to the brokenhearted. And when we feel like we have been in exile, far from the favor of God, he is right beside us. When we have suffered abuse, Jesus himself is with us. We're not the objects of God's wrath, but rather we are the recipients of his grace. Jesus has taken the consequences of our sin upon himself and has delivered us from our own offenses. And what's more, God redeems more than just our souls. God redeems our suffering. Near the end of the book, Elijah comforts the people of Israel with these words of encouragement. He writes, "The Spirit of the Lord has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance for our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair." Isaiah 61 verses 1 to 3. Funerals often send us back into the archives looking for the physical evidence of our loves. I had this picture of Aunt Barbara that I could see in my mind's eye, and I wanted to find it, and there it was, in a photo album from January of 2004, which amazingly is 20 years ago, almost to the day. It was right after the lost Christmas, as we call it in our house, the year when the twins were new. In fact, they were still under warranty. In fact, Devon bloomed with chicken pox on Christmas Eve that year, and Jacob and the twins followed on New Year's Eve. And once all of that had cleared up, we made a trip up north to introduce the twins to all the extended family up north. It was a bittersweet visit, a bit more than a year after Julie's mom Glenna had passed away. What started me on this wild goose chase looking for this photo, there was this picture that I knew we had of Aunt Barbara and one of the twins. It was Daniel. I remember that when she met them for the first time, she just snuggled them right up to her, breathing in that baby smell until he latched onto her chin. Now, in the picture, it does look like she's forcing it, but to be honest, it was consensual. I was there, so don't worry about it. While looking for that picture, though, I found another. We have lots of pictures of Julie's family meeting the twins, and they all have this familiar look to them. They were, of course, delighted to meet the twins, but when you see the pictures now, years later, there is this touch of grief in the photo as well. It had only been a year since the funeral. Glenna was found absent in a lot of ways during those years, but never more so than in that first year. But somehow out of that loss, about 10 months later, there was this unexpected abundance. Joy and sorrow, both together. In chapter 4, after Ruth has delivered a baby boy, the townswomen, with tears of sadness and joy, declare, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth." Ruth 4, verses 14 and 15. Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for it. In fact, in the Hebrew, there is this sense in which that Naomi claimed this boy, and the women observed it, proclaiming, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed, which means servant. And it's true. He served as an unlikely branch of the family tree, connecting and restoring a lost son back into his people. He was a father to Jesse and a grandfather to King David. Nobody would have dared suggest it, though. But it was true. God doesn't cause famine and war and starvation and loss, but God redeems our suffering, not just our souls. Nobody would have dared say it, but Ruth would have never come to Israel if not for this. Boaz would have never been part of this story if they hadn't left, if Elimelech and the boys hadn't died. God doesn't kill to remake a family tree, but God brings beauty from ashes. He redeems our losses. Through his own death, He has brought us life. God brings back what is broken and somehow makes it more. Nobody would dare have said it. It was almost a sacred thought. How God had used a famine not to send a family away, but instead to bring it back.